Today, we're going to talk about climate change, natural disasters, and housing. And it's going to relate to accessory dwelling units, especially with insurance policies in California. What if I told you that in the coming decades, more than 20 million Americans will have to move because of natural disasters and climate change? That's a conservative estimate, but it's at the heart of The Great Displacement, this book by Jake Bittle. It's nonfiction. On the surface, this is a book about climate-driven migration. But dig deeper, and you're going to find it's really about the future of housing in America. I'm Ryan O'Connell, and I think every book is a housing book. And I also relate everything to ADUs. And so we're gonna go through this book, which is about the environment and displacement. And that displacement is a good hint as to this is actually a secret housing book. But here's the kicker. This isn't just an abstract theory, right? Natural disasters are already hitting home, right? Quite literally. And the insurance nightmare that Bittle covers in this book, as well as all the federal policy and local policies that are affecting real homeowners, they're already happening. They're already affecting homeowners. So we're going to talk about how that overlaps with the ADU world and housing all around the country. And we'll also go further afield to see how our policies are failing us around the country. Get this, in Texas, when the book goes there, we pay people to move out of the flood zone because their house keeps flooding. And so instead of paying to repair their house every few years, we're now paying people to move out of the flood zone. Makes sense. But then they use that money. There's nobody who tells them where to move. So people have received money to move out of a flood zone, and they use that money to go buy a house and move into another flood zone. So in the next 20 minutes, or maybe less, I'm going to unpack some of the wildest housing stories from this book, give you my honest take, and we're going to explore how to build resilient housing for the future or risk getting trapped in bureaucratic nightmares that hurt us all. This is the Discretionary Review, where we talk about books that build. The rest of this channel, To ADU, is devoted to helping homeowners build in their backyards. And the Discretionary Review is a kind of new podcast ushered in by the incredible wealth of good media being created today about home building and housing policy. We're reaching a phase where lots and lots of media exists. There's so much to read and watch, and I think it may be helpful to share some of my favorites here on the pod. Let's talk about the Great Displacement. So the main thesis of this book is that the United States of America is about to undergo its biggest migration ever, larger than the African American diaspora, alluded to in the book's title, right? The Great Displacement is kind of an allusion to the Great Migration, and larger than the migration resulting from the Dust Bowl, too. The way Bittle studies this topic is really interesting. The structure of the book is very fascinating. He goes around to actual towns and cities in the US where that climate migration is already happening. It's really fascinating. He follows individuals and then ties it up with bigger ideas in the region and then ties that up to bigger ideas in the country. It's a really interesting way to go through that structure. And you're going to get some chapters where a quick, sudden disaster causes a lot of sudden change. And you also have places where it's sort of a slow, steady change over time that displaces or kills a community. The places we go in the book are culturally diverse too. It's not overly focused on big cities. When we visit Houston, we'll actually spend a lot of time outside of Houston in the burbs. Similarly, New Orleans is surprisingly omitted from the book, but we instead spend a lot of time in rural bayou towns. But Bittle knows his stuff. He's a staff writer at Grist, which focuses on climate change for all of its subject matter and environmental policy. He has done a lot of research on cities like New Orleans, on cities like Houston. And ironically, that turns up in some of the Houston chapter because all the folks from New Orleans who moved to Houston. And you can get the sense that he's studied the big issues, the big city issues nearby, but he's choosing to write about the smaller town with a population of 70,000 or 200,000 outside of the big city. In the book, there are chapters on the Florida Keys, Kinston, North Carolina, Santa Rosa, California, Pointe-au-Tremont, Louisiana, Houston, Texas, and parts of Arizona and Norfolk, Virginia. And beyond this, there's a dark irony because we also watch where people move to when they leave the places that are struck by natural disasters or climate change. And spoilers, people in this book end up moving to places specifically to avoid disasters. And tragically, the disasters follow them to their new locations. There's a person who gets displaced by a hurricane, and they decide to move north and really far inland to completely avoid hurricane flooding for the rest of their lives. They moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and it's been in the news this past month because of what's happened with Hurricane Helene. And there's this unprecedented flooding in Asheville. And I think it's crazy. This book was published very recently, February 2023, and we already have a whole new slew of disasters since then. And that's part of what Bittle uncovers. You can sense his frustration in the afterword of this book. He's finished the book and he's trying to shoehorn in current events that are currently happening, right? Recent climate disasters, so that the book doesn't seem out of touch, right? So he's not like ignoring places. But as he's shoehorning in these events, there's more and more disasters. He's getting up to the publishing deadline. He can't fit them all in. They're just happening too frequently to keep a book up to date. And here we are, 1 year after it was published, and the very town that was seen as a refuge from hurricanes is hit by a hurricane, and we see the tragedy on TV. Bittle says, just like the story of climate change itself, these people's stories don't have clear and definitive endings. There's no arbitrary stopping point. In some sense, the arc of an individual human life is the wrong vehicle for a book about how mankind has mutilated the earth over the course of the last several centuries. In another sense, though, documenting the impact of climate change on individual people is the only accurate way to tell the story of the broader crisis, since we ourselves can only perceive and understand the world from our own limited vantage point. I added vantage point there. You just said vantage. Sorry, Bittle. But I think it's such a serious topic, and he treats it with the intensity and journalism that it deserves. And it's a really interesting book for that reason. One of the things that I'm talking about here when I talk about the homeowner who moves to Asheville, North Carolina to avoid hurricanes and then gets hit by a hurricane, that's really speaking to some of Biddle's big idea. We're not facing the same disasters we always faced, and there's a progression to these disasters that is caused by climate change. They're getting worse or they're getting more extreme. And the way we move when we face climate change, it's not a direct arrow. Like sometimes people think of migration as like, oh, well, you move from location A to location B, just whoop. It's more like a pot of boiling water. That's the illusion that Biddle uses. And he says these disruptions bubble up here and there, and they cause us to move around very turbulently, very unpredictably. And that's what he studies by going deep into each of these locations and looking at the housing situations in each of these places. So I'm going to say this book has two big themes in it. One is sort of a no-brainer plea for people to take climate change seriously, because even if we curb global warming and rising sea levels, we are already experiencing a touch of the extreme displacement that will be caused by the changes we've already caused and initiated. It's going to be hard to unring that bell. And obviously, if you're interested in environmental science, climate activism, and the overlapping fields, I would highly encourage you to read the book to hear these stories. But honestly, if you're watching this, you probably already believe that there is an imperative to reduce our impact on the environment and to try to preserve the Earth's habitability in as many regions as possible. So I'll focus more on the second movement in this book. The second part is that it draws attention to a whole mess of housing policies. There are a lot of housing policies that come up in this book, to the point where I'd say this is one of the best housing books I've read this year. It's kind of scattered across hundreds of pages, so you have to collect all these stories and examples. But by the end of it, you have a very good sense of how our housing laws affect the displacement caused by our environmental conditions. So Biddle understands that climate migration isn't like other forms of migration. He actually talks a lot about another book, which we'll talk about, Sonia Shah's book, The Next Great Migration, which deeply studies international immigration and deconstructs it pretty convincingly. But by the end of this book, you're like, oh, migration's in your mind, man. We're all immigrants. What are borders? Biddle focuses on climate migration within the U.S., so not traditional immigrants, right? Just people moving from one place in the country to another place. And he shows it's not like a bunch of people just deciding to like go to college in New England for a few years. Instead, it's when a disaster strikes, it displaces thousands of people in an instant, and it lays bare the economic fault lines in a community. That sudden upheaval accelerates and amplifies the slower, often invisible forces of gentrification. And the aftermath reveals in stark relief who can afford to rebuild and who is forced to leave, exposing long-standing inequities that have been simmering beneath the surface. And you see this in federal policies as well as local spending decisions. We make calculations about where the Army Corps of Engineers should try to shore up levees and where we should engage in managed retreat, right? Those are kind of the two options. Do we invest in fighting nature and staying, or do we invest in retreating from nature? And FEMA's at the center of a lot of these choices too, by offering flood insurance or by choosing to pay out that flood insurance or offering similar amounts for homeowners to leave their homes. FEMA also has policies that force issues like determining if a home has less than 50% damage and can be renovated, or if it's over 50% damage and it needs to be brought up to code. That latter decision often de facto pushes people out of their home and out of their neighborhoods forever. So there's also a recurring question of who bears the cost of all these disasters. Like if FEMA is going to mark off whole neighborhoods as flood zones, do we leave the homeowners in those newly drawn maps holding the buck on valueless homes? There's this meme about it's Ben Shapiro or somebody saying, "Oh, they could just sell their houses," and somebody breaks through the wall and goes, Who's gonna buy these homes, Ben? Aquaman." But there's this question of are we going to subsidize that process? Are we going to subsidize insurance companies? Are we going to all of these questions involve loss of a very expensive asset, and who should be paying, who should be responsible for our transition into the country that we're going to be 50 years from now, wherever people have to move based on these disasters. I think that's a good time to go into the Santa Rosa chapter in California. And this is how it's most related to ADUs, which is what we normally talk about on this channel. When it goes into chapter 3 on Santa Rosa, there was already a housing shortage there before any fire. And he talks about vacancy rates and basically how little housing there is available, how few choices people have to rent or own a house or an apartment. And then you pepper in some pretty absurd insurance policies and a big natural disaster. There were some fires in 2017. And all of a sudden you get insane results. So in addition to losing hundreds and hundreds of units, you also see those hundreds and hundreds of families displaced. And some of them have insurance policies that say, oh, we'll cover up to whatever the value of your house was. So renters who used to be in a giant house, they're getting insurance companies to pay $7,000 a month for their rent for a place that cost maybe $1,500 a few weeks before the fire, right? Their insurance company is on the hook to pay the whole rent. So it's not like they necessarily mind the price gouging, but that price gouging did happen. And then in the meantime, families nearby whose insurance policy was very similar, but the value of their house that burned down was different, their insurance will not cover $7,000 a month. And so they have to move maybe a 2-hour drive away because that's the first place they can find housing that isn't being raised to these sort of post-fire prices. They have to change their kids' school. They have to find new healthcare providers. They have to find new communities and so on. And eventually these families often get slingshotted across the country where they can crash on a relative's couch or their couches for a year or more while they figure out how to recover from this big life-altering event. When you read that section, you start wondering how these insurance companies can afford to pay out several $1,000s a month per policyholder all at once. Well, the insurance companies were wondering that too, and they started raising rates and canceling policies. And then state legislators got involved and said there'd be a moratorium after a disaster where insurers can't drop clients. But then insurers start treating it like whack-a-mole almost, where it's they need to balance their books and balance their risk portfolio. So they're going to parts of the state where there haven't been fires and dropping policies and raising rates there while they still can. And then they're waiting for the moratorium to end on the regions where there have been fires. And it's just not helping anybody, right? Um, Anyway, I make everything about housing policy. So you can imagine the hairs on my neck get raised for the majority of this book, where every chapter is a study in how humans have worsened natural disasters in a couple ways. One, by creating more extreme climate conditions, and two, through economic and civic policies that don't help all these people displaced by the disasters equally. So, the ADU issue specifically, I meet a lot of homeowners now who are trying to get their insurance policy to cover the ADU, and that's an important step in your process, right? And as we face more and more insurers leaving the state of California, the costs on that are going to go up and up and up. And it's gonna be a scary landscape if we don't get ahead of these issues. So it's important for you, if you're doing that kind of project, to know about this ahead of time and to kind of incorporate it and pay attention to the landscape of our state policies and how they interact with our climate change policies. Something to keep in mind. Okay, Yimby or NIMBY, I would my rating system. I'll say this is a very Yimby book overall. Um, Bittle shares my belief that people should have access to housing and choices about where they live, although the book doesn't really beat you over the head with that. He also understands that supply is artificially constrained and raises housing costs. The nuanced part here is that Biddle understands some forms of what we call infill housing will only create short-term housing. So he's very much in the school of like Jenny Schutz, who says, stop building homes in the wrong places. That's another book somewhere on this desk. Ta-da. This feels especially stark in a place like Houston, where they've managed to build a lot of homes, and that keeps housing costs down in a sense. But they've also done that by creating major environmental hazards that threaten to displace entire neighborhoods each time that there's a major storm. And again, there's a whole chapter about it in Biddle's book. So if you want to see, like, is this real? Is like, what's the real impact of the natural disaster or the climate change over time? that's what that's what the details of the stories are there for, right? That's why you want to sink your teeth into this. He's also relatively progressive in that he identifies specific places where there's a lot of inequity if we proceed too blindly with certain policies. So I think on face, it can seem fair to come up with a math formula in Washington, D.C., and apply it equally to every state and every neighborhood. And that seems like it's fair because it's one it's math and it's one size fits all, it's rigorous. But in practice, when you apply those types of formulas, you end up finding a lot of situations where you're taking resources away from a disproportionate number of places where poor people live. And if you're a colorblind free market warrior, this book might be pretty eye-opening. I would give it a shot. Also, who should definitely read this book, if you know a housing person and you want to get them into environmental issues, give them this book. And vice versa, if you know an environmentalist, ecological person, and you want to get them housing curious, this is the gateway. I would contrast this with the Sonia Shah book that I showed earlier, which is more if you want to convince somebody to chill out about international immigration. That is a different kind of read. Um, and now, if you have thoughts about this, please leave a comment, or better yet, send me a video. I'm trying to get people to submit short video reviews for a segment called Public Comment.